The ground was still settling when Darraxus Bronzebrew first heard it. It came from somewhere beneath his boots, a low grinding complaint of stone against stone, and for a moment the whole of Coldridge Valley seemed to hold its breath. Snow shook loose from the pine boughs above the road. A distant crack echoed off the mountain face to the south, and then came the screaming. Not the screaming of men, something older and something angrier. "That doesn't sound good," said Grimir. Darraxus turned to look at his brother. Grimir Bronzebrew was leaning against a fence post with the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago that looking unbothered in dangerous situations was half the battle. His crossbow was strung across his back, his quiver freshly stocked, and at his feet sat Murray, a barrel-chested hound of indeterminate heritage, whose primary contribution to any situation was an absolute refusal to be impressed by it. Murray lifted one heavy jowl, sniffed the air, and then placed his chin back on his paws. "That," Darraxus said, "is the sound of us being volunteered for something." He was right. 50 yards up the road, a stocky dwarf in the green and gold of the Ironforge Mountaineers was waving both arms over his head with the urgency of a man who had already lost his patience and was now working through his reserves. "Hey, you there!" The dwarf's voice carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to being heard over wind, cannon fire, and dwarven arguments, which amounted to the same thing. "You're a stout-looking pair. Lend us a hand." Grimir looked at Darraxus. Darraxus looked at Grimir. Murray looked at neither of them, which was his way of expressing that he had already assessed the situation and found it beneath his dignity. "We could keep walking," Grimir offered. "We could," Darraxus agreed. He picked up his axe from where he had set it against a tree stump and rolled his shoulders until something popped. "We're not going to." "No," Grimir said, pushing off the fence post. "We're not." He whistled once, sharp and low, and Murray was on his feet before the sound finished. The hound shook himself, sending a small avalanche of snow and fur onto Grimir's boot, and fell into step beside him with the air of a soldier who had long since accepted his lot. The Mountaineer met them halfway. Up close he was broad even by dwarf standards, with a braided red beard shot through with silver, and a face that had been weathered into something resembling the mountain itself. The insignia on his pauldron marked him as captain. "Joren Ironstock," he said by way of introduction. "Mountaineer captain, Coldridge Company, and I'll skip the pleasantries because we haven't the time for them." He jerked his thumb south towards the sound of shooting and the clash of metal. "That earthquake shook a whole warren of troggs up out of the ground, and they're steamed about something fierce. My men are holding the line best they can, but they're getting pressed hard." Darraxus peered south. Through the tree line he could see the shapes of mountaineers falling back, shields raised, and behind them the squat, lurching silhouettes of troggs. Hunched and furious, waving crude implements with the enthusiasm of creatures who had just woken up angry and found something to hit. "How many?" he asked. "Enough," Ironstock said, which was the honest answer. "Right," Darraxus settled his grip on his axe. He looked at Grimir. Grimir was already stringing his crossbow. "Murray," he said quietly. The hound's ears pricked forward, his tail stiffened. Something changed in the animal's brown eyes. That particular shift from household companion to something considerably more dangerous. "Stay close." Murray showed a single tooth, which served as his version of acknowledgement. They moved at a run. The situation south of the road was worse than it had looked from a distance. 3 mountaineers had formed a rough line at a low stone embankment, pushing back against a mob of troggs that showed no interest in being organized about their assault. The creatures were thick-limbed and gray-skinned, their faces set in permanent scowls beneath heavy brows, and they threw themselves against the dwarven shields with the blind fury of things that did not understand the concept of retreat. Darraxus hit the flank hard. He put his shoulder into the first trogg before it knew he was there, sent it spinning sideways, and brought his axe around in a short, controlled arc that removed the immediate problem. The second one had time to turn and swing a club roughly the size of a chair leg, and Darraxus caught the blow on his forearm guard and let the momentum carry him forward, inside the creature's reach, where the follow-up was clean and final. He heard Grimir behind him, the rhythmic crack of the crossbow, bolts finding marks with the calm efficiency of someone who had been hunting since he was old enough to hold a weapon. And beneath the sounds of the fight he heard Murray, a low, continuous snarl that was somehow more alarming than barking. the sound of a dog who had selected a target and intends to see the matter through. The troggs were relentless, but they were not coordinated. Darraxus pushed through them steadily, holding the line the Mountaineers had started to lose, planting himself at the point where the mob was thickest and simply refusing to move. There was a particular quality to fighting as a warrior, a kind of weight that came with the armor and the stance and the knowledge that your job was to be the thing that did not give ground. He had always understood in his bones. You were the wall. You did not move. Grimir worked the edges, picking off stragglers, redirecting the ones that tried to flank. Murray operated somewhere between them, half discipline and half instinct, driving off the troggs that broke through and buying the Mountaineers the half-second they needed to recover. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. It felt longer. When the last of the troggs retreated back into the cracks and fissures they had come from, the valley was quiet again except for the heavy breathing and the wind moving through the pines. Darraxus lowered his axe. He was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow where he had not moved quite fast enough, and his left arm would ache tomorrow from the blocked club strike. He considered this an acceptable accounting. One of the Mountaineers clapped him on the shoulder with the enthusiasm of someone very glad to be alive. Grimir walked up beside him, reloading the crossbow with the practiced calm of habit, and Murray pressed against Grimir's leg and looked up at him with an expression that clearly communicated that this had been adequate, though not particularly impressive. "Good lad," Grimir told him, and scratched behind the hound's ear. Captain Ironstock met them as they walked back, and for a moment the old dwarf just looked at them both, measuring what he saw. "Impressive work, lads," he said at last. His voice had lost its edge. There was something quieter in it now, something that might have been relief, or the recognition of something useful. "We can hold the perimeter from here on out." He reached into the satchel at his hip and produced a pair of wrapped packages, which he handed over with the directness of a man who did not attach ceremony to gratitude. "Here, take this for your troubles. It might come in handy." Darraxus unwrapped his, a whetstone kit, good quality, better than standard issue. Grimir held up a set of fletching tools and turned them over in his hands with the approval of someone who knew their value. "You said it might come in handy," Darraxus said. "That sounds like a man with a follow-up." Ironstock looked at him sharply. Then, slowly, he allowed himself something that was almost a smile. "Aye," the captain said. "As it happens." He glanced back towards the valley, towards the mountains to the north and east, toward whatever it was the earthquake had stirred up beyond what they had already handled. His expression settled into the particular gravity of a man who knew more trouble was coming and had not yet decided how much of it to explain. "I've got something more important to ask of ye," he said. Murray sat down in the snow and waited. Ironstock waited until his men were out of earshot before he spoke again. "All right, Darraxus," he said, dropping the formal bearing just enough to make it feel like a confidence. "I know a thing or two about troggs, and the one thing I know is this. The biggest, strongest troggs get the most respect. The brutes value strength over anything else. Rank, cunning, age, it doesn't matter. Size and the willingness to use it, that's the whole of their politics." He pointed south and east, past the tree line where the last of the trogg mob had dissolved back into the broken terrain. "You see those great big ones, the ones sitting back behind the front lines where the smaller ones do the pushing. That's as close as the troggs get to what you'd call a leader. They don't direct the others exactly, they just exist, and the others follow because they can't think of a reason not to. So take out the big ones and the rest lose their nerve," Darraxus said. "That's the theory," Ironstock said. "Go show them what it means to mess with sons of Ironforge." Grimir had been listening from a few feet back, fletching tools turning in his fingers. "You want us to walk into the middle of a trogg encampment," he said. "Find the largest, most aggressive ones specifically, and pick a fight with them." "Aye." "Murray," Grimir said. The hound looked up. "We're doing that thing again." Murray exhaled slowly through his nose. It was not quite a sigh. It was the sound of a dog who had long accepted that the terms of his employment were negotiated poorly. They were halfway back towards the southern tree line when a second dwarf intercepted them. He was lean where Ironstock was broad, with the quick eyes of someone perpetually assessing damage, and he was already moving towards them before they had fully registered him. "Hold a moment," he said. He carried no weapon, only a battered leather satchel and the clasp worn smooth from heavy use, and an expression caught somewhere between urgency and apology. "Name's Sten Stoutarm, company medic for what that's worth today." He glanced at Darraxus. "Listen, I've got no need for your blade, but I do need someone with a steady hand and a bit of courage." "I have one of those," Grimir said. Stoutarm looked at him, assessing. "Our Mountaineers are trained to protect the village from the odd wolf attack, not an all-out trogg invasion. Many of our best have succumbed to wounds and exhaustion, and they're lying out there in the snow, because we haven't the hands to bring them all in." He opened the satchel and produced a first aid kit, rolls of clean linen, and a small clay pot of something that smelled strongly of elf root, packed with the efficiency of a man who had learned the hard way what to bring. "Take this and assist as many as you can." Grimir took the kit without hesitation and turned it over in his hands, checking the contents with the hunter's practicality. Field dressing a wound was not so different from field dressing game. The principle, if not the sentiment, was the same. "I'll handle the wounded," he said. He looked at Darraxus. "You handle the big ones." Murray looked between them with an air of deliberation that lasted approximately 1 second before he sat down firmly at Grimir's heel. Darraxus looked at the dog. "Traitor!" Murray said nothing. He was already watching Grimir for the signal to move. They separated at the tree line. Darraxus went south and east where the brutes were. Grimir went south and west where the fallen mountaineers lay scattered across the hillside in ones and twos, some conscious and swearing colorfully, some very still. The first one Grimir found had taken a blow across the ribs that had cracked at least 2 of them and left him propped against a boulder trying to breathe in careful increments. Grimir crouched beside him without ceremony, opened the kit and got to work. Murray stationed himself 4 feet away and watched the tree line with the focused attention of an animal that has decided a job needs doing. "You're not a Mountaineer," the dwarf said, watching Grimir's hands. "No." "Passing through?" "Something like that." Grimir wrapped the binding tight and tied it off. "Can you walk?" The Mountaineer considered. "Aye, slowly." "Then walk slowly towards the camp and keep walking until you get there." He moved to the next one. The brutes were not hard to find. They stood out against the terrain the way boulders stand out in a field, large enough and still enough that the eye went to them instinctively. But up close they did not behave the way Darraxus had expected. The smaller troggs had pressed the Mountaineer line and been wild with fury, throwing themselves at the dwarves' shields with no apparent concern for their own well-being. These were different. They held back. They paced the broken ground beneath the main push, occasionally stopping to crouch and press their palms flat against the earth, as if listening for something. He took a moment before the first engagement to watch them. The markers at the fissures caught his eye first. Small arrangements of carved rock and tooth and knotted fiber that could have been debris if you were not looking at them properly. Left at the entrances to the cracks in the earth where the earthquake had split the valley floor open. He did not have long to think about it. The nearest brute caught the shift in the air that precedes violence and turned with surprising speed. It carried no weapon. It did not seem to feel the lack. The first blow hit Darraxus' shield hard enough that he felt it in his back teeth. He braced, let his weight drop, held the line. Up close the brute was even larger than it had looked from a distance, close enough that Darraxus could see the faint tracing of darker pigment across its brow. Old markings of some kind, worn nearly smooth. The thing's eyes were small and pale and filled with something he had not expected to find in them. Not rage, not hunger, something that looked, in some uncomfortable register, like grief. He put that observation aside and hit it with his axe. Grimir worked his way across the hillside with methodical calm, Murray moving with him from position to position, nose working the wind, growling once when a pair of small troggs came too close and sending them off at a scramble. Some of the mountaineers had been lying in the snow long enough that their wounds had stiffened, and a few required more persuasion than medical attention to accept help from someone they did not recognize. "I don't need a bandage," said one, a woman who had taken a gash across her forearm that very much suggested otherwise. "I need my axe back. It's down the hill." "The axe will keep," Grimir said. "The arm might not." She argued for another 30 seconds and then let him work, which was all he had expected. Murray sat beside her while Grimir dressed the wound, and she scratched the hound behind the ear with her good hand in the absent way of someone who needed something to hold on to that would not admit it. "Good dog," she said. Murray accepted this as a professional due. The fight with the brutes was harder than the line holding had been. They didn't swarm, they didn't panic. They met force with force and held their ground with a kind of grim personal commitment that was almost respectable. And when one fell, the others did not break. They pulled back, slowly, step by step, towards the fissures, protecting the approaches to something below. Darraxus pressed them the full length of the broken ground, alone and working harder for it than he would admit later. Without Grimir on the high ground picking off the flankers, he had to move more, cover more distance, absorb hits that a well-placed bolt would have prevented. His arm was bleeding from a shallow cut by the third engagement, and his boots were soaked through from driving across ground that still had not decided whether it was solid. When it was done, he stood in the thin winter light at the edge of a fissure and looked down into the dark. Whatever the troggs had built down there, stone and tunnel and the deep places they called home, the earthquake had collapsed it. The wall had come in. He could see it from the way the stone had fractured, the particular violence of a thing falling inward. He understood then what the markers meant, what the brutes had been guarding. He stood there for a moment, breath steaming in the cold air, and did not feel the satisfaction he had expected to feel. Grimir appeared at his shoulder a few minutes later, first aid kit reduced to its last 2 bandages, Murray trotting close at his heel with his coat damp from the snow. "They weren't attacking the camp," Darraxus said. "They were coming out of it." Grimir looked at the fissure, at the collapsed dark below. "Their tunnels came up right under our road. The earthquake hit and everything under them just..." He made a quiet sound. "They lost everything they had down there. And they came up and the first thing they saw was us." Murray sat down at the edge of the fissure and looked into the dark. His ears were low. "Come on," Darraxus said. "Let's go tell Ironstock what the job cost." Sten Stoutarm met them before Ironstock did. He was counting the Mountaineers coming in off the hillside with the unconscious habit of a man running tallies. And when he saw Grimir, he broke into something close to relief. "Many of those you saved have already made it back to camp," he said. He looked over the dressed wounds on the dwarves filing past with a professional eye and gave a short nod. "The wounds are well dressed, I'll say that." He looked at Grimir with the frank assessment of someone who had spent the morning watching people make poor decisions under pressure. "You might have a future in first aid if you're into that sort of thing." "I'll keep it in mind," Grimir said. Murray sneezed, which was either commentary or coincidence. Ironstock heard everything without interrupting. He listened to Darraxus's account of the brutes, the markers, the collapsed tunnels, and then he was quiet for a long moment. "They blame us for destroying that home, you say," he said. "That's the impression I got, aye." Ironstock pulled on his beard. "Well, that wasn't us. That was the earthquake we had this morning." He said it with the reflexive certainty of a man stating the obvious, and then he stopped, and the certainty was settled into something more complicated. "Are they that dense that they can't see we nearly lost our camp too?" Neither Darraxus nor Grimir answered that. The captain was quiet again. He looked south, towards the broken ground, the fissures, the small marks left by a large hands in the frost-split stone. "Can't blame a trogg for fighting for his home, though," he said, and the words came out softer than anything else he had said all morning. Murray turned his head and looked at the captain with the patient attention of an animal that has learned to read the tone of human voices. Darraxus rolled his shoulder and felt the bruise from the brute's first strike already deepening. He thought about the fissure, the collapsed dark below it, the look in an enemy's eyes that he had not expected and could not quite set aside. "What's next?" he asked. Ironstock straightened. Whatever reflection had briefly moved across his face was gone, replaced by the flat practicality of a man with a camp to hold and a situation still unresolved. "We appreciate your help out here, but there may be a place where you need you even more." He tilted his head northwest towards the slope rising away from the valley floor. Through the pines, half obscured by distance and the thin morning haze, a stone structure sat solid against the mountain. "Due to the trogg attacks and the quake, we're putting all civilians on lockdown inside Anvilmaw, just up the hill. Go and talk to my wife, Jona. She's inside." A pause that carried more information than the words before it. I'm certain she's in need of able-bodied help such as yourselves. There was something in the way he said it, a faint, careful neutrality that suggested he was choosing the word need over several other words that would have been more accurate. What's she like? Grimir asked. Ironstock looked at him for a moment. She's capable, he said. He turned back to his perimeter before either of them could follow up on that. The path to Anvilmar wound upward through snow-heavy pines, the ground rising steeply enough that Darraxus felt it at his thighs. Murray bounded ahead and then doubled back repeatedly, conducted his own patrol of the trail with the self-important energy of a dog who's decided that a job worth doing is worth doing thoroughly. Capable, Grimir repeated as they climbed. He said it like it was the best available compliment, Darraxus agreed. That's either a very good sign or a very bad one. In my experience, those are the same sign. Anvilmar was larger than it appeared from the valley. The main hall was built in the iron-forged style, all heavy stone and low-arched ceilings, the walls thick enough to take a siege. Inside it was warm and crowded within the controlled chaos of a lockdown in progress. Civilians from the valley had been moved in, miners and farmers and craftspeople and their children. And the hall had the specific atmosphere of too many people sharing a space under circumstances nobody had planned for. Bedrolls had been laid in rows along the far wall. Someone had set up a soup cauldron near the fire. 3 children were chasing each other around a support pillar despite the earnest objections of an elderly dwarf who had clearly been objecting for some time without effect. In the center of it all, simultaneously directing 2 conversations and reading a parchment list, was a dwarf woman whose hair was the color of old iron, and whose expression communicated with great efficiency that she was fully aware of everything happening in the hall, and had opinions about most of it. She did not look up when they approached. Whatever it is, she said, it's either already handled or it's your own problem. We're looking for Jona Ironstock, Darraxus said. Then you found her, and we've wasted both our time because I can plainly see you didn't bring more bandages or a second cauldron. She made a mark on the parchment. So, what do you want? Can't you see I'm busy here? Murray sat down and observed her with the cautious respect of an animal that has correctly identified where the authority in the room actually lives. We've just come up from the valley, Darraxus said. Captain Ironstock sent us. Go and bother someone else. I haven't the... She stopped, the parchment lowered by 2 inches. Wait. She looked at him properly for the first time. What's that you say? Joren sent you. Her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but reorganizing, the way a storm front reorganizes before it decides what kind of weather it intends to be. Well, why didn't you say so? The parchment disappeared into a pocket, and her full attention landed on them with a weight that was not unlike the way Joren Ironstock gave orders, redirected through a different set of priorities. Right, she said, already moving toward the supply tables along the far wall, expecting them to follow without asking whether they would. Let me have a look at the 2 of you. You've been in it clearly. That cut above your eye needs cleaning before it festers. And... She glanced at Darraxus's arm. What happened there? Blocked a club, Darraxus said. With your forearm? With my shield mostly. Aye, and then with your forearm. She put a clean cloth from a stack and damped it from a nearby basin. Sit. Darraxus considered the relative merits of explaining that he was fine and decided against it. He sat. Murray, seizing the moment, rested his chin on Jona's boot. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. Something passed between them that defied precise interpretation. Whose dog? She asked. Mine, Grimir said. He's harmless. She returned to cleaning Darraxus's eyebrow cut with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this since well before today's crisis. Tell me everything. What happened down in the valley? All of it. Joren gives me the summary. I need the actual account. Darraxus told her. She listened the way her husband listened, without interrupting, though her hands kept moving, tending the cut, reaching for the salve, never idle. When he got to the part about the trogg brutes in the collapsed tunnel, she made a small sound low in her throat that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but something between them. The earthquake, she said when he finished. Aye. She wrapped the last of the bandaging and stepped back. We felt it up here too. Lost half of the shelf goods in the storeroom and cracked the north wall clean through. It wasn't natural that quick." She said it in a way people say things that they've been thinking for a while and have not yet said aloud. "I've lived in these mountains my whole life. I know the sound of the earth makes when the deep stone shifts. This was something else." "What kind of something else?" Grimir asked. Jona looked at him, then at Darraxus, then at the hall full of displaced people and crying children, and a soup cauldron that was not quite large enough for the job it was being asked to do. "The kind that means we're not done yet," she said. She picked up her parchment list and held it out. "There are things in this hall that need doing and not enough hands to do them. You'll help." It was not a question. Murray's tail moved once across the stone floor, which was as close as he came to enthusiasm. "Right," Darraxus said. He took the list. The list had one item. Darraxus read it. He read it again. "It says ale," he said. "It says ale," Grimir confirmed, reading over his shoulder. From across the hall, without looking up from the civilian she was directing, Jona Ironstock raised her voice to a volume that suggested she had anticipated exactly this response. "I don't know how anyone expects to get any work done around here if we don't have any ale. Our beer level in Anvilmar is dangerously low." She turned, and there was a brightness in her eyes that had not been there a moment ago. The particular energy of a woman who has reached the item on the list she actually cares about. "Lucky for us, we've stowed some backup kegs just for such an occasion. West of Anvilmar, along the valley's northern border, you'll find kegs of Stormhammer Stout and Theramore Pale Ale. Just to the east of here, you'll find a stash of Gnomenbrau." A brief pause for effect. "That's me personal favourite." Darraxus looked at the list. He looked at the hall full of frightened civilians and injured mountaineers and an ongoing earthquake-related crisis. "The ale is load-bearing," Grimir said in the tone of a man who has lived among dwarves long enough to understand the logic. "The ale is load-bearing," Darraxus agreed. They turned to go. They had taken approximately 4 steps when the second voice caught them. "Ah, you there, my boy." The dwarf who had materialized from behind a cluttered workbench in the corner of the hall was older than Ironstock, with white hair pulled back from a broad forehead and the particular look of someone who had just found the conversation he'd been waiting all morning to have. He wore a craftsman apron over his Mountaineer colors and was holding, with considerable reverence, what appeared to be a small piece of carved stone. "Grundel Harking," he said, extending his free hand, "Armorer, and in better times an enthusiastic student of Dwarven history." He held up the carved stone. "Are you into archaeology?" Murray sniffed the stone and then looked away, which was his version of a verdict. "We're into being helpful," Darraxus said carefully. Harking beamed. "Then we've an exciting opportunity right outside our front door. All the shaking from today's seismic event has knocked a number of artifacts loose from the soil around the encampment. Things that have been buried out there for generations, just waiting." He leaned forward with the intensity of a man about to share something he finds genuinely extraordinary. "Survey along the valley's northern border and you shall find all sorts of treasures. Bring some back to me and perhaps we can study them together. Right then, off you go." He returned to his workbench before they could respond, already bent over his notes with the focused energy of a scholar who considers conversation a necessary interruption to research. Grimir looked at Darraxus. "We're fetching ale and doing archaeology," Darraxus said. "Why, the valley is under trogg attack." "Murray," Grimir said. The hound sighed deeply enough that his whole body moved with it. The western route hugged the valley's northern border, following the tree line where the pines grew close enough to cut the wind. The cold bit harder up there than it had on the valley floor, and the snow was undisturbed except for the tracks of birds and the occasional heavy impression of something that had decided the border was close enough and turned back. They found the first cache tucked behind a natural windbreak of stacked stone, 2 kegs of Stormhammer Stout sitting patient in the snow as though it had been expecting someone. The kegs were heavy and well sealed. The wood still sound despite the cold. Darraxus lifted one, Grimir lifted the other. Murray inspected both with professional thoroughness and then took point on the return, apparently deciding that cargo this significant warranted an escort. The Theramore Pale Ale was 50 yards further west, a single keg marked with a blue seal that had blurred in the frost. Grimir slung it across his shoulders with the resigned competence of someone who had learned that complaining about a load does not make it lighter. "Theramore," he said, adjusting the weight. "Long way from home." "Most things worth having are," Darraxus said. They turned east. The eastern side of the valley's border told a different story. The earthquake had done more work here. The ground buckled and split in long irregular seams that ran thoroughly north to south, as though something enormous had dragged a finger across the earth from below. Snow had fallen into the fissures and frozen in strange formations, and in several places the upheaval had pushed old things up through the frost. The Gnomenbrau was where Jona had said it would be. A carefully wrapped bundle of small kegs tucked into a stone alcove with the deliberate placement of someone who had thought about exactly this emergency. Darraxus understood then that the ale requisition had not been impulsive. Jona Ironstock had planned for the possibility of needing emergency morale supplies. She had simply been waiting for a pair of capable hands to go and collect them. He filed this observation away under things he would not say aloud. The artifacts were harder to spot and easier to find, which was a contradiction that resolved itself once Darraxus understood what he was looking for. Hard to spot because they were small pieces of carved stone and worked metal no longer than a fist. The kind of thing invisible in ordinary soil. Easy to find because the earthquake had done the excavation, pushing them up through the frost line and leaving them sitting at the surface like objects placed for collection. He crouched beside the first one, a fragment of something larger, dark stone carved with a knotwork pattern worn smooth with age. Not trogg work. The lines were too precise, the geometry too deliberate. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. "Darraxus," Grimir said from 10 yards away. He was holding something similar, though his piece carried a partial inscription along one edge, letters in a script recognizable as ancestral Dwarven but too weathered to read. "How old do you think?" Darraxus asked. Grimir turned the piece over. "Old. Before Ironforge old, maybe." Murray had found his own artifact. He was sitting next to it with the alert stillness of a dog that had located something interesting but had been trained not to pick it up. It was a carved disc, small enough to fit in a palm, with a relief image that might have been a face or might have been a mountain. It was difficult to say. "Good boy," Grimir said. Murray's tail moved twice. They came back to Anvilmar laden with 2 kegs of Stormhammer Stout, 1 keg of Theramore Pale Ale, 4 carefully wrapped Gnomenbrau kegs, and a collection of stone and metal objects that had last seen daylight before anyone currently living had drawn their first breath. The hull noticed the ale before it noticed anything else, which was probably the correct order of priorities. Jona Ironstock crossed the room with a speed that suggested she had been watching the door. She took the Gnomenbrau from the bundle with both hands, and the focused attention of someone reuniting with something important. She examined the seal. She nodded once with the gravity of a formal assessment. Then she opened it and took a drink. The hall was briefly quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when something significant is happening. Jona lowered the keg. She breathed out slowly through her nose. Something in her expression, the operational tension that had been running through her since the moment they had walked in, eased by precisely 1 notch. "Ah," she said, "that hits the spot." She set the keg down on the nearest table with the decisive thump of a woman returning to business. "Now we can get some work done around here." Within 30 seconds she was directing 2 conversations again. The Stormhammer Stout was being distributed to the Mountaineers along the wall, and the Theramore Pale was already promised to someone who apparently had prior claim on it. The hull had not transformed, but it had, in some difficult to quantify way, stabilized. Darraxus watched this with a feeling he eventually identified as professional respect. Grundel Harking received his artifacts with the reverence of a priest receiving holy relics. He laid them out on his workbench one by one, turning each piece under the lamplight, making small sounds of satisfaction that required no particular translation. The carved fragment, the inscribed piece, Murray's disc, which Grimir presented with the air of someone ensuring proper attribution. Harking held the disc for a long moment, his thumb tracing the relief image. "Wonderful," he said quietly. "Look at this one." He turned it toward the lamp so the light caught the carving at an angle. It must be over 200 years old, at least, possibly much more. He set it down gently and looked at the collection with the expression of a man who has just received more questions than answers and finds this entirely satisfying. Now, on to other matters. He trailed off, already reaching for his notes, the artifacts already becoming data to be cross-referenced and interpreted. The two dwarves who had brought them already peripheral to the more pressing business of what the artifacts meant. Darraxus and Grimir stood at the workbench for a moment. He's going to be busy for a while, Grimir said. Murray looked at the inscribed piece one more time, then turned and walked towards the fire, where there was a warm stone and considerably less archaeology. Outside, through the thick walls of Anvilmar, the wind had picked up along the valley's northern border. The fissures left by the earthquake were still open, still running in their long irregular seams across the frozen ground. And somewhere below the frost and the broken stone, the deep places were silent in a way they had not been before the morning's shaking. It was the silence of something ended, or the silence of something waiting. In the hall behind them, Jona Ironstock was already 3 tasks into whatever came next. The ale secured, the wound tended, the civilians settled. Joren Ironstock held the valley below. Sten Stoutarm counted his recovered soldiers. Grundel Harking catalogued evidence of a history that the earthquake had surfaced without explanation. And 2 brothers stood at the threshold of a stone hall in the mountains and understood, without needing to say it, that what had begun this morning as a matter of holding the line had become something larger. The valley was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. So, Grimir said, what now? Darraxus picked up his axe. Now we find out what caused that earthquake. Murray appeared at Grimir's heel, fully rested and entirely ready, the fire forgotten, his eyes on the door. They walked out into the cold together.